I drove my old Ford down Interstate 25, the road stretching ahead like a strip of cold steel under the morning sun. The Rocky Mountains faded in the rear view, standing silent and eternal, witnesses to every chapter of my life. 62 years old, I'd survived snowstorms and scaffold collapses, but that morning, my hands trembled like a young builder on his first day. Maybe it was because I was driving toward a day people say time stands still, the day my daughter was supposed to be married. 7 years had passed since Margaret died. The house in Colorado Springs had since shrunk to the sound of a ticking clock and the smell of black coffee each morning. I'd learned to live slowly, to reread old engineering books, to prune the garden, to talk to myself without feeling foolish. But today was different. Today, I was leaving that quiet world, carrying something heavier than luggage, the last promise I ever made to my wife. On the passenger seat sat a small wooden box, its lid carved with a sprig of lavender. Inside was a silver watch Margaret used to wear when we were newly married. Before she passed, she had taken my hand and whispered, so faint I barely caught it, "Give it to Emily on her wedding day." I glanced at the box, feeling both proud and uneasy, as if it contained not just time, but all the words we never got to say. Emily used to text me often, "Dad, I need a little more for the restaurant deposit. The dress is late. Can you help?" My mother-in-law wants something elegant. Don't let them think we're cheap. I never hesitated. That's what fathers do. Build bridges, pay tuition, settle bills without complaint. They say American parents teach independence, but I never really learned how to let go. When the sign "Welcome to Denver" appeared under the orange sky, my heart started beating faster. The city unfolded in glass and motion, dazzling and strange. I slowed down when I saw the Grand Horizon Hotel, a mirrored tower catching the last light of day. Emily had once said it was her dream venue, with a ballroom overlooking the Platte River and the biggest chandelier in the state. I smiled at the memory, turned off the ignition, and lifted the wooden box as if holding something too fragile to trust the air with. The summer heat pressed down heavy, the smell of wildflowers mixed with exhaust. I wheeled my suitcase across the shining marble floor of the lobby, its chandeliers scattering light like frozen rain. Everything was so elegant it made me feel like an intruder in a world I didn't belong to. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played soft and distant. At the front desk, a young clerk smiled politely and asked if I had a reservation. I told him I was here for the wedding and wanted to find the reception room so I could give the bride her gift. He checked the screen, then frowned slightly. I took out my phone and called Emily, my stomach tightening. The line rang 3 times before she picked up. "Dad, I'm really busy right now." Her voice was rushed, distracted. I forced a smile no one could see. "I just got to the hotel, sweetheart. Which ballroom are you in? I'd like to see you before everything starts." There was a pause just long enough for me to feel it. Then, a soft laugh, muffled under background music. "Oh, Dad, we actually got married yesterday. It was just something small, family only, no big deal." The sound around me seemed to vanish. I froze, phone in hand, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My car keys slipped from my fingers, clinking against the polished floor. The clerk bent down to pick them up, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you all right, sir?" I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," but it didn't sound like me. It sounded older, hollow. I turned, searching for some explanation, but the answer was already on the wall across from me. A silver banner gleamed. Thompson and Carter Wedding, June 5. Beneath it, a framed photograph, Emily in her white gown, smiling next to Jake. The same smile that once filled our home with light now struck through me like a blade. I walked away, toward the small cafe tucked in the corner of the lobby. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and sat by the window. The waiter, an elderly man with thinning white hair, asked if I was here for the wedding. I gave a small, tired smile. "No, I'm not on the guest list." He didn't say another word, just nodded, his eyes soft with the kind of sympathy you don't ask for. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through Emily's old messages, each one cut deeper than the last. "Just a little more, Dad. Mom's family wants it to look perfect. I'll pay you back right after the wedding." Line by line, I saw it clearly. Now I hadn't just paid for her wedding. I'd paid for my absence from it. The coffee came, hot and bitter. I took a sip and watched the steam drift upward. My heart pounded, though I sat completely still. Around me, couples in pressed suits and shimmering dresses passed through the lobby, laughing, glowing, full of futures. I wondered if Emily thought of me at all when she walked down the aisle, or if she'd already edited me out of her story. I stayed there until the light faded. The hotel glowed against the night sky, every window alive with someone else's celebration. I caught my reflection in the mirror behind the counter, an aging man holding a gift no one wanted, standing outside the frame of his own family portrait. I drew a slow breath, stood, and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, I turned back once more. Emily's picture was still there, smiling as if nothing in the world could hurt her. I didn't know whether to be proud or broken. I only knew one thing. Something was deeply wrong, something beneath the surface of what she'd said. And as I stepped out into the thick Denver night, I felt it in my bones this was only the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. The Denver night wind blew hard, carrying the smell of exhaust and leftover champagne drifting out from the hotel's ballroom. I walked slowly across the parking lot, each step echoing against the cold concrete, like the hollow sound of something inside me breaking apart. The sign for Thompson and Carter wedding still glowed beneath the corridor lights, and Emily's smiling face stared out from the photograph radiant, untouched, as if there had never been a father standing outside the frame. That smile was beautiful, complete, but the longer I looked, the more I realized it no longer belonged to me. I followed the exit lane, the neon lights catching my reflection in the glass. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt, clutching a wooden box so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I looked like someone who had wandered into a story that wasn't his. Across the street, a small cafe was still open, its flickering sign barely holding the words Riverside Cafe against the darkness. Inside, only a few people remained. A young couple sat in the corner, the man holding the woman's hand as they laughed over something small. Another man read a newspaper, his coffee long gone cold. I took a seat by the window, set the wooden box beside my glass of water, and ordered a black coffee. The waiter nodded without a word. I unlocked my phone. The screen lit up my face. The message thread with Emily stretched endlessly, a scroll of familiar requests. Dad, I need the deposit for the restaurant they're holding the date. Dad, the dress is delayed. I need a little more. My mother-in-law wants a grand ceremony. Don't let them think we're poor. Each line appeared sharp, metallic. I remembered how I'd felt the first time I read them. Proud, needed, grateful to still matter. I'd always believed a father's duty never ends, that love was proven in quiet acts of giving. But sitting there under dim cafe light, I realized the voice behind those messages wasn't the same girl who used to run to greet me after work. It was the voice of someone distant, deliberate, who knew exactly how far she could pull before the line would snap. The coffee came. Its bitter smell filled the air, stirring memories of mornings with Margaret on our porch. She liked hers weak. I liked mine strong. She used to say the bitterness reminded us that life was never sweet for long. I took a sip, and the burn in my throat carried tears I refused to shed. An older janitor pushed his mop bucket past, silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent light. He paused by my table, smiling kindly. "You here for the wedding, sir? You look like one of the hotel guests across the street." His voice had that soft Midwestern warmth, gentle but foreign. I nodded once, then shook my head. "No, I'm not on the guest list." The words fell heavy, one by one, like stones dropped into a well. The old man stood quietly for a moment, then just nodded again. His eyes held something I couldn't bear to see pity. I pressed my lips together, murmured thanks. He moved on, the wheels of his cart squeaking faintly until the sound disappeared behind the door. I sat there listening to the wind slip through the crack under the entrance, carrying the faint sound of car horns from the distance. I opened the photo Emily had sent me the week before a fitting session in her wedding dress. That smile once made me feel I'd sell the whole world just to see her happy. But now, I saw something else in her eyes, a distance, small but unmistakable, like she was already living in a world where I no longer existed. I scrolled through our old messages, searching for any trace of affection, but all I found were lines beginning with, "I need, I have to, I will." And my replies, always the same. "Sure. Okay. Don't worry." Outside, headlights swept across the window. Another couple walked past, hand in hand, her dress catching the light like a fragment of the moon. I felt invisible. For a moment, I thought of Margaret. If she were still here, she wouldn't have let me sit alone like this. She would have looked me straight in the eye and said that love must have boundaries, that no one has the right to use another's kindness as leverage. I spoke softly, to no one in particular. "You were right, Margaret. I let trust become the chain that held me." Another waiter passed by, placed the check on the table. I nodded, left a few bills, and stood up. When I stepped back outside, the Denver wind was still sharp, the golden lights of the grand horizon burning bright across the street. The wedding banner still stood there, bold and almost taunting, as if it knew I was watching. I crossed the road without thinking. Maybe I just needed to look one more time, to carve the pain deep enough so it would never fade. The framed photo gleamed under the lights. Emily in white, her head tilted slightly, smiling the way I used to believe she smiled only for me. Beside her stood Jake, his grin wide, the look of a man who thought he had won something. My eyes traced the lower corner of the print, where faint gray letters spelled "Photo" by Linda T. Photography, Linda Thompson, Emily's mother-in-law. The whole wedding, I realized, had been organized, staged, and immortalized under another woman's name. A woman who now held the place in the story that was once mine. A chill spread down my spine. I turned away, walked out into the night. My car waited in the far lot, bathed in weak, yellow light. I opened the door, sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. The world felt still. From inside the wooden box came the faint ticking of the silver watch, steady and fragile. I lifted the lid. The second hand twitched once, then stopped. I touched it gently, as if feeling for Margaret's heartbeat trapped in that small circle of time. If she were here, what would she tell me to do, forgive, or find the truth? I didn't know. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted. The sadness was still there, but beneath it, something else had begun to form, something quieter, colder, resolute. From a nearby car, Simon and Garfunkel's "The Sound of Silence" drifted through the night. I smiled faintly, turned on my headlights, then reached out and switched the radio off. I didn't need music. I needed silence. Because I knew, as the city hummed and the night pressed close, this was only the beginning. The next morning, I left Denver before the sun had risen over the mountains. The highway was almost empty, only the steady hum of the tires on asphalt and the chill of dawn slipping through the cracked window. On the passenger seat lay Margaret's wooden box, the small silver latch catching what little light there was. I drove in silence. No radio, no music, just the low rhythm of the road and a mind heavy with questions that had no answers. Emily was married. She hadn't told me, hadn't needed me, and maybe, just maybe, there was something deeper beneath it all. When I turned onto the familiar road leading into Colorado Springs, fog hung low among the pine trees, the kind that muted sound and memory alike. My house appeared slowly through the haze, the same old roof lined with dry leaves, the weathered window frames, the faded Carter nameplate barely clinging to the gate. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of damp wood. I set my keys on the table, hung my coat, and went straight to the study. The oak desk was exactly as Margaret had left it. On the wall hung the photo of her and Emily in the lavender garden, both smiling in a way that made the whole world seem safe. I pulled out the bottom drawer, the one where I kept what was left of her life. A thin layer of dust covered a tin box the color of tarnished silver. Inside were folded notes, a few old photos, and a letter tied with a frayed ribbon. I untied it carefully. Margaret's handwriting flowed in gentle, patient curves, leaning slightly to the right. If one day our child loses her way, bring her back with truth, not anger. The words felt like fingers pressing against a wound I didn't know was still open. I set the letter on the desk and stared out through the fogged window. Her voice echoed in my mind, soft and calm, like the way she used to speak after dinner when the house was quiet. I knew she would never tell me to be angry, but I couldn't understand why Emily had done what she did. I stood up, pulled my laptop from the drawer, and powered it on. The fan hummed faintly as the screen came to life. I logged into the retirement account I'd been building since 2015, the money I set aside for the years when work would stop, for sickness, or maybe just solitude. When the balance appeared, my stomach tightened. The total was barely a third of what it should have been. I opened the transaction history. A long list scrolled down, month after month of steady withdrawals, 3,000 here, 7,000 there, each marked with the same cold note. Vendor payment, E. Carter Thompson. My name, fused with my daughter's married one, printed as if I had approved every cent. I clicked through the details. Payments to a Denver restaurant, a wedding photography studio, an event planning service. But between them were others odd ones. A boutique in Aspen, a jewelry store, a travel agency in Miami. I opened each receipt, my pulse quickening. Every one listed the payee as Emily Carter Thompson. The letters looked mechanical, clean, deliberate, as if they'd been placed there long before I ever noticed. Each number on the screen felt like a blade, quiet but cutting deep. I had spent 30 years on construction sites, weathering winters that cracked skin and bone, just to save every possible dollar. And now, in a matter of months, it was gone. Not to an accident, not to illness, but to the daughter I had once taught that honesty was the first foundation of any structure worth building. I printed the statements. The machine hummed steadily, spitting out crisp sheets lined with rows of black numbers. The warmth of the ink barely reached my skin before it faded to cold. I didn't know whether to call Emily or stay silent. Part of me needed to hear her voice. Another part was afraid of what she might say. I looked up at the photo of Margaret on the wall. Her smile was soft, knowing. Her eyes seemed to see right through me, as if she already knew what I would do before I did. I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did you know this would happen, Margaret? Did you know she'd do this?" There was no answer, only the steady ticking of the clock in the living room patient, unbothered, marking time as if nothing had changed. I gathered the printouts and walked to the living room. The desk lamp was still on from the night before, throwing a pale light over the family photo on the shelf. Emily, 8 years old, beaming, holding the model suspension bridge we'd built for her school project. I sat on the couch, placed the photo beside the stack of papers. On one side, memory. On the other, proof. Between them was a silence I didn't know how to fill. Outside, the sky began to brighten. I opened Margaret's letter again and read the same line. If one day our child loses her way, bring her back with truth. I sighed, folded the letter, and placed it in the wooden box beside her watch. The second hand still moved slow, steady, as if to remind me that time doesn't stop for anyone's pain. I stood, gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and locked it in the cabinet. I knew now this wasn't just about being left out of a wedding. This was something larger, calculated, deliberate. Emily hadn't just erased me from her ceremony, she had taken what I had built for the rest of my life. In my mind, memories collided. Margaret's laughter, Emily's childhood smile, the sound of waves on the California coast where we once vacationed. Something was stirring inside me, not anger, not yet, but a quiet, heavy resolve. I knew I wouldn't stay silent forever. I needed to know where this began, and why my daughter had chosen this path. The morning air in Colorado Springs smelled of pine resin and damp grass, sharp and cold in the thin light. I gathered all the statements and printed records, clipped them neatly inside a folder, and slipped it into my briefcase. The city was quiet when I drove through downtown, stopping in front of a red brick building near Tejon Street where a frosted glass sign read Evelyn Carter and Associates, attorneys at law. The glass door chimed softly as I entered, releasing the scent of paper and strong coffee from the reception counter. Evelyn stepped out from a meeting room, a straight posture, dark brown hair tied in a firm knot, eyes sharp but calm. She was 59, 3 years older than me, and had been Margaret's closest friend since their church teaching days. She invited me in, pulled out a chair, and told me to take my time, not to skip any detail. I set the folder on her desk and started from the beginning, from the grand horizon to that night at the Riverside Cafe. I told her about the shining wedding sign, the photograph of Emily smiling as if her father didn't exist, the text messages, and the money I kept sending without hesitation. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She nodded occasionally, jotting notes in blue ink with her fountain pen. When I opened the folder and spread the printed statements across her desk, the rustle of paper was loud, like the faint cracking of old tiles beneath our feet. She picked up the summary page, scanned the columns, and paused at the line labeled Vendor Payment, E. Carter Thompson. Her brow tightened slightly. She asked if I had ever signed any payment authorization related to Emily's wedding. I nodded, explaining that, about 8 months ago, Emily had sent me an electronic authorization form, saying the bank needed it to hold dates with the restaurant and the photography team. I'd signed it without reading the fine print, assuming it was just a formality for a high-end venue. Evelyn flipped to the attached contract and pointed to a small line buried at the bottom. The clause allowed the event representative to open sub-accounts for processing related expenses and to shift payment channels among listed or added vendors, including any location or partner changes. Her tone was steady, almost clinical, as she said that, legally, someone could use my signature to create a secondary account and move funds from my retirement account as long as it was marked as an event expense. I asked why there were payments to a boutique in Aspen and a travel company in Miami. Evelyn pulled the appendix closer, checking merchant codes printed on each receipt. She explained that if those expenses were tagged as event-related, they could slip through the filters unless the bank performed a deep audit or received a formal complaint from the account holder. Then she looked at me, eyes steady, voice warm but firm, and said, "This wasn't just about a party. This was abuse of authorization, and possibly financial fraud if intent could be proven." I said I didn't want my daughter to face criminal charges. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then said that what I wanted and what needed to be done to protect my remaining finances were two different things. She outlined 3 steps. First, notify the bank immediately to freeze any new withdrawals from my retirement fund or its linked subaccounts. Second, coordinate with the fraud department to flag merchant codes and mark all transactions unrelated to the wedding, based on the receipts. Third, file a preliminary report with the Denver Financial Crimes Unit, not to prosecute, but to lock down any active transfer channels. I asked if that meant putting Emily at legal risk. Evelyn said I controlled the scope and timing of cooperation, that formal charges were my choice. Sometimes justice, she said, is just reminding someone what consequences look like. I sat silent for a while, watching the pale Colorado sky through her office window. It was so blue it hurt to look at. Down on the sidewalk, a young woman carried her baby past a maple tree. The child reached for a leaf, laughing. I turned back and said I'd do steps 1 and 2 today, but needed a night to think about the third. Evelyn nodded and handed me a contact sheet with the names of the bank's fraud manager and the duty officer at the Denver unit. We made the calls right there in her office. Evelyn put the first one on speaker. I told the bank manager I needed to freeze all withdrawals connected to the event authorization dated 8 months ago. His voice was calm, efficient. After verifying a few details, he confirmed that alerts had been applied, and all payments labeled vendor payment E. Carter Thompson were blocked pending investigation. When I hung up, a weight lifted slightly from my chest, like I'd built a small dam against an underground current. The second call was to the fraud division. They asked me to email all questionable invoices with notes explaining why purchases like the Aspen Boutique or the Miami Travel Agency weren't related to the wedding. Evelyn drafted the email on her computer, attaching scanned copies of every receipt, the language precise and neutral. She told me to take a break, then added quietly, "Let's talk about people, not just money." She asked when I'd last spoken with Emily about something other than expenses. I tried to remember. It had been a long time. Every conversation lately had been about deposits, bookings, menus, or the worries of her new in-laws. I admitted that I'd liked being needed, that every request had made me feel I still mattered in her world. Evelyn didn't comfort me or condemn me. She just said that constant help can sometimes teach people the wrong law, that every door is always open. Before I left, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed copy of the authorization form I'd signed, the section about sub-accounts highlighted in yellow. "Keep this," she said. "Not to blame yourself, but to remember, never sign anything when your heart isn't clear." I nodded, slipped it into my pocket, and thanked her for being honest. Outside, the noon sunlight hit the sidewalk hard, bright and unkind. I stood beneath a tree's shadow and pulled out my phone. Emily's name filled the recent call list. Short calls, mostly texts. I closed it and opened an old photo of her as a child. Hair in messy braids, dirt on her face, holding the tiny suspension bridge model we'd built together. I whispered softly, "I'm still your father, but that has to end where it should." I started the car and turned back toward home. In my jacket pocket was the contact sheet for the bank and the financial crimes officer. In my head, Evelyn's voice lingered slow, steady, final. The path ahead was still blurred, but for the first time in weeks, I knew where to start and what I needed to do before the day was over. That afternoon, as I was sorting through the papers Evelyn had given me, the phone rang. A number from Denver area code 303. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. A young woman's voice came through, polite, precise, and clear. She introduced herself as Clara Nguyen, a fraud investigator from the bank. She said they had completed a review of all transactions labeled vendor payment, E. Carter Thompson. One transfer stood out a payment to a business called Roast and Bloom Cafe in Aspen. Her tone softened as she continued. The registered owner of that business was Jake Thompson. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling my pulse slow in disbelief. Clara explained that the bank had found the account's registration documents attached to a business license. The digital copy contained my signature, but the signature had been scanned and pasted onto another form. She said she would email me a copy to confirm. I thanked her, forcing my voice to stay even, though my hand trembled slightly. When the email arrived, I opened it immediately. The image on my screen made my chest tighten. It was my signature, the same slant, the same long tail at the end, identical to the one I'd placed on the event authorization form last year. But the background didn't match. The border was blurred, the lower right corner cropped. I zoomed in and saw it clearly, the faint edge of a scan where the signature had been lifted and dropped in. Beneath it, a line read, "Co-signer, Benjamin Carter." I sat still for a long time, the air thick around me. Roast and Bloom Cafe, a coffee shop in Aspen 3 hours from here. I'd never been there, never heard the name, but now it stood like a symbol of betrayal. Jake Thompson, my son-in-law, the man who once called me dad, who helped fix my roof when my back gave out, had used my name to legitimize money drawn from my own retirement fund. I sat in my study, the afternoon light cutting through the window, falling across the spread of bank statements. The numbers and letters seemed to look back at me, steady and cold. I wondered what Margaret would have said if she were here. Evelyn's words from yesterday came back. Justice is sometimes just reminding someone of the cost. But what cost could ever reach people who had laughed inside the safety of my trust? I set down the phone and stood. Outside, the sky had turned gray, heavy with rain. I put on my coat and drove to street. Andrew's Church on Cascade Avenue, the same place Margaret and I used to visit every Sunday. In the courtyard, a few parishioners were arranging flowers for the evening service. The scent of pine and wax greeted me as I walked down the aisle, the air thick with the calm of ritual. Reverend Michael Green sat in the front pew, a worn Bible in his hands. He was past 60 now, tall, white-haired, with the kind eyes of someone who had seen more sorrow than joy. When he saw me, he smiled gently and asked if I wanted to sit for a while. I nodded, took a seat beside him, and laid the envelope across my lap. I told him everything. The letter from Margaret, the missing money, the discovery that my daughter and her husband had used my name to fund a business. I said I didn't know what to do, that any step I took might turn me into the father who destroyed his daughter's life. Finally, I asked, if justice tears a family apart, does God still smile? Michael stayed silent for a long time. He set the Bible down and looked up at the wooden crucifix above the altar. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, not a sermon, just truth. He smiles when you keep your soul intact, he said. None of us can control another person's choices. We can only control our response to them. Sometimes silence is forgiveness. Other times, silence is complicity. You have to know where you stand between the two. I bowed my head, unable to speak. His words echoed in the still air, broken only by the faint whistle of wind through the church windows. Margaret used to say that Michael Green could read what people didn't say out loud. She had been right again. I realized then that my silence had gone on too long and that silence had let everything spiral beyond repair. He asked if I still had Margaret's letter. I nodded and pulled it from my coat pocket. The paper was soft, yellowed with age, her handwriting still clear. I handed it to him. He read a few lines, then nodded gently. She always believed you'd do the right thing, he said. But doing the right thing isn't always painless. Sometimes the pain is what keeps your soul from hardening. I took the letter back, holding it tightly. The texture of the worn paper brought back nights when Margaret would sit by the lamp, writing quietly while the rest of the house slept. Every word she'd written felt meant for this very day. If one day our child loses her way, bring her back with truth, not anger. I exhaled, saying I wasn't sure I still had the strength to believe in truth. Michael rested a steady hand on my shoulder. Truth doesn't need your belief, he said softly. It only needs you not to turn away from it. Outside, the rain began to fall, heavy drops striking the roof in a steady rhythm. I stayed long after Michael had left, alone with the golden light of the candles and the sound of rain. The letter in my hand grew damp at the edges where the drops had fallen. I wiped it gently, folded it, and slipped it back into my coat. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had softened. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. I walked slowly to the car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel. On the passenger seat, Evelyn's envelope still waited, untouched. I started the engine and drove into the gray evening, carrying Margaret's letter, and the bitter, undeniable weight of truth that no longer had a name. The next few days passed like fog, drifting over a frozen lake, quiet, dense, and suffocating. Every morning I woke with the same heaviness pressing against my chest, as if the truth about Emily and Jake had settled inside me and turned to stone. I still brewed coffee, still unfolded the morning paper, still sat by the same kitchen window, but the motions felt mechanical, hollow. My eyes moved across the headlines, yet my mind stayed elsewhere. circling the forged contract Clara had sent and the words in Margaret's letter that refused to fade. I hadn't replied to Clara's email. I hadn't called the financial officer Evelyn had urged me to contact. Some part of me believed that if I stayed still, if I didn't move forward, the wreckage of my family might not collapse completely. That illusion broke late one morning. I was sitting at my desk, laptop open, letting the blue light wash over me. For the first time in years, I logged back into social media, a place I had avoided since Margaret's funeral. The feed flickered with birthdays, vacations, polished smiles. Then a post caught my eye. It came from one of Linda Thompson's friends, Emily's mother-in-law, a woman I'd never met, but whose presence I had always felt hovering between Emily's anxious messages. The image loaded slowly, Emily and Jake, standing beneath a chandelier that dripped gold across the ballroom. Her white gown shimmered like snow under sunlight. The caption beneath it read, "So proud of my daughter-in-law and her dream wedding. Thank you to her wonderful father." I read the sentence twice. Her wonderful father. The words lodged somewhere between my ribs. My lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but it felt more like pain, pretending to be calm. Below the post were dozens of comments, strangers marveling at the luxury, the perfection, the fairy tale love, all of them celebrating a story where I had been erased. I scrolled through the photos. Emily's smile gleamed in every one, radiant, rehearsed, untouchable. Jake's hand on her waist, his eyes fixed on her, as if the world belonged to them. They looked like a couple from a magazine spread, polished, perfect, utterly false. Because I knew what made that glow possible. My retirement fund, my forged signature, and a cafe in Aspen named Roast and Bloom. I closed the laptop. The air in the room felt thick, heavy enough to crush the space between my breaths. Then the phone rang. A number from Denver. I almost let it go to voicemail, but habit, or maybe some cruel instinct, made me answer. "Mr. Carter?" The voice was smooth, poised, with a trace of command. "This is Linda Thompson, Jake's mother." I said nothing at first. "I just wanted to thank you," she continued, "for your incredibly generous contribution to the wedding. Emily is so lucky to have a father like you." Her tone dripped sweetness, but beneath it was something else, a self-satisfied composure, the kind of tone people used when they believed the world naturally bent toward their desires. I stared at the wall, forcing my voice to stay level. "Maybe that was my last investment in their dream," I said. Silence. Then a soft, amused laugh. "Oh, you're funny, Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm sure we'll see each other soon." The line clicked dead. For a long moment, I just sat there, the phone still warm in my hand. My reflection in the dark window looked older, harder. "Funny," I murmured. There was nothing funny about having the savings of a lifetime turned into confetti for people who didn't think I belonged in their celebration. I thought of Margaret, how she used to tell Emily that honesty built stronger foundations than wealth ever could. But somewhere along the way, Emily had traded her mother's quiet truth for Linda's shining facade. I could almost hear Margaret's sigh, could almost feel her disappointment pressing against the silence. I rose from the chair, went to the desk, and pulled the folder of bank statements from the drawer. I printed another set of copies, each sheet sliding out of the printer with a sterile hiss. When I was done, I stacked them neatly, slipped them into a brown envelope, and sealed it shut. My hands shook a little as I pressed the flap closed. It felt like preparing for a war I didn't want to fight, but one that had already reached my doorstep. By dusk, I was on the road. The sky over Colorado Springs had dimmed into iron gray, the last light of the sun fading behind the peaks. The envelope sat on the passenger seat like a silent witness. For months I had let hesitation blur the edges of my resolve, but tonight, hesitation felt like betrayal. When I reached Denver, the city lights were cold and distant. The police headquarters rose ahead of me, gray, square, without welcome. I parked, stepped out into the wind, and carried the envelope inside. Officer James Daly was waiting in a cramped office that smelled of old coffee and wet paper. His face was calm, the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much. He shook my hand, nodded toward the chair. I sat. He opened the envelope carefully, scanning the documents, page by page. When he reached the forged contract, he tapped it twice with his finger, then looked up. "This is abuse of financial authorization," he said. His voice was measured, professional, but the truth beneath it cut sharp. "Not a felony on its own, but ethically severe. You can file a formal report. If this signature is falsified, we can trace the source of the transfer and identify who was responsible." The words hung in the air like a weight suspended by a thread. File a report. My pulse echoed in my ears. The room smelled faintly of ink and rain-soaked coats. Daly slid the form toward me, placed a pen beside it. I took the pen. The tip touched paper, but my hand froze. A small bloom of ink spread, like blood from a pinprick. For a moment, I saw every signature I'd ever written for Emily. College forms, apartment leases, car loans. Each one had been an act of trust, a gesture of belief. Now that same gesture had been turned into a weapon. I need more time, I said finally, the words quiet but certain. Daly studied me for a moment, then nodded. Keep the file safe, Mr. Carter, he said. When you're ready, call me. I stood, feeling older than I had an hour ago. The envelope felt heavier now, like it carried not paper but a history I could no longer escape. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. The city lights blurred through the mist, and for the first time in a long while, I understood the sound Margaret once described as the stillness before a storm. Because that night, as I walked back to my car, I knew the storm had already begun, and it was mine to finish. He said he understood, his voice calm, not pitying, but heavy with experience. Many parents, he told me, had sat in that very chair and whispered the same words, hoping delay could undo what was already done. He advised me, almost gently, to at least keep the preliminary case number. If you ever change your mind, he said, writing a line of numbers on a card, you'll be able to pick it back up without losing the trail. His pen moved slowly, carefully, as if he understood that each digit was a door I wasn't ready to open. He slid the card across the desk, met my eyes, and added, if anything new happens, another suspicious transfer call right away, before they drain what's left. I nodded, slipped the card into my old leather wallet, the one Margaret gave me the day I retired. It had softened over time, the edges cracked, like me. When I stepped outside, the air hit cold against my face. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than the weight of paper should allow, like it carried not evidence, but consequence. I drove toward Colfax Avenue, toward Evelyn's office, because somehow I believed that only she, the last link to Margaret's steadiness, could help me find my footing in this storm. Her office was exactly as I remembered it, precise, understated, filled with the faint scent of coffee and paper. Evelyn looked up from a stack of files as I entered. Her silver hair was tied neatly, her expression sharp but kind. She didn't ask questions. She simply gestured toward the chair across from her desk. I told her everything. The meeting with Officer Daly, the form I couldn't bring myself to sign, the fear that one pen stroke could turn me into the man who ruined his own child's life. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She listened the way Margaret used to, quietly, without judgment, with a patience that made the silence heavier than words. When I finished, she folded her hands and said softly, Benjamin, you can't save anyone by pretending nothing happened. Her tone was calm, but it landed like a verdict. If you let this go, she continued, Emily won't learn remorse. She'll learn that trust is a resource that can be mined, and next time it won't just be money. I looked at her, feeling the truth closing in. My voice came out low, almost cracking. But I can't save her with anger either. Margaret always believed love could fix anything. Evelyn leaned forward, resting a hand on my arm. Her touch was steady, grounding. Margaret also believed that love without truth is just decoration. If you hide from what's real, you'll lose both your daughter and yourself. Her words cut deep, cold, and clear, but they also carried something I hadn't felt in weeks: direction. I sat back, the room spinning slightly as her sentence replayed in my head. Love without truth is decoration. She stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. You need to freeze your remaining accounts today, she said. That's how you protect what's still yours. I'll call First Colorado Bank myself. For a moment, I didn't answer. I just looked at her, the way you look at a compass after wandering too long without one. Please, I said finally, the word barely audible. Help me. She didn't hesitate. Evelyn dialed the number, introduced herself, and asked for Clara Wynne. As she spoke, I turned toward the window. Outside, traffic moved along Colfax in smooth, steady lines, lives continuing, unshaken by betrayal or loss. The world went on, indifferent. I thought of Emily's wedding smile, of Linda Thompson's voice dripping with smugness, of Jake's forged signature on a document that carried my name. And beneath all that, I thought of Margaret, her steady hands, her voice when she wrote that letter years ago. Lead her back with truth, not anger. When Evelyn hung up, she exhaled slowly. It's done. Clara's freezing the accounts before end of day. She'll also flag every transfer connected to Roast and Bloom. Benjamin, be ready. If they dig deeper, this might not stay quiet for long. I nodded, my chest tight but steady. I could feel it, the invisible line I'd just crossed. There was no going back now. Thank you, I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I stood, picking up the wooden box that held Margaret's watch. Evelyn smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed worry. Take care of yourself, Benjamin, she said. Margaret would want you strong for this. Outside, Denver had turned gray, the kind of dusk that presses low against the buildings. The air bit through my coat as I walked to the car. When I started the engine, my reflection in the windshield barely looked human, just a silhouette carved out of exhaustion and quiet rage. The drive home was long. Headlights blurred into ribbons of light as I thought about the inevitable Emily finding out her access was gone. I could already hear the phone ringing, could already imagine her voice. Scared, angry, cold. I didn't know what I would say. Maybe nothing. Evelyn's words echoed. Truth is the foundation of love. Then Green's voice followed. Justice is putting things back where they belong. But what if justice meant tearing apart what little remained? What if putting things back where they belong left nothing standing at all? By the time I reached Colorado Springs, night had fallen thick and silent. I unlocked the door, stepped into the darkness, and set the envelope and the wooden box on the table. The house smelled faintly of pine and dust. I sank into the armchair, the one Margaret used to read in. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, indifferent to the storm gathering just beyond the walls. Each sound was a reminder. Time keeps moving, even when you're not ready. I sat there for a long while, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the next knock on my door or the next call on my phone would change everything. But for that one small moment, I let myself be still. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to belong to a family that hadn't yet broken. And in that fragile quiet, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding all along. The real betrayal wasn't what Emily had done. It was how long I'd known it was coming and kept pretending she wouldn't. 2 months later, autumn crept quietly into Colorado. The air carried the scent of pine and smoke, and every afternoon the sun stretched low over the Rockies, pouring gold like thin honey over the ridges. I kept my small routine's coffee in the morning, a few pages of the Denver Post, trimming the lawn until the world felt in order again. Since the day I filed the report with the police and froze the accounts, my life had turned eerily still. Sometimes I couldn't tell if that silence was a reward or a sentence. That night, rain was falling over Denver, light but persistent, brushing against the windows like fingers that wouldn't stop knocking. I sat in the living room. The lamp cast a pale circle of warmth on the table where Margaret's photo stood beside the old clock. The second hand ticked steadily, the only heartbeat left in the house. At 10:30, the phone rang. Emily's name glowed on the screen. My hand froze above the receiver. For a moment, I thought about letting it ring out, but the sound cut through me like memory itself. I picked it up. The first thing I heard was her breathing uneven, desperate, the kind that belongs to someone who's been crying. Dad, she said finally, her voice cracked, raw. Jake's cafe. It's falling apart. The tourists are gone. They cut off our electricity, and the Wi-Fi too. I can't pay the staff anymore. Can you help us? Just once. Please. For a few seconds, I said nothing. Rain tapped harder on the glass, steady and cold. On the other end, I could hear her stifling a sob. I imagined her sitting alone in that cramped apartment, surrounded by darkness and the faint sound of dripping water from a leaky ceiling. Somewhere behind her, Jake's voice a dull edge of irritation, then the sharp slam of a door. Her voice wavered again. I know I've made mistakes, Dad, but I can't let them take everything. Please, I don't know where else to turn. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on Margaret's photo. Her smile, frozen in the amber light, looked almost alive, patient, waiting. And all at once I remembered that night at the Grand Horizon Hotel, when Emily had stood in front of me and said, "Only family is invited." I had stood there like a man carved from stone. And now, the same voice, the one that had cast me out, was shaking, asking for salvation. Do you remember what you told me that night? I said quietly. I suppose I still don't count as family. The silence on the line was thick enough to touch. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Her breath hitched. I just want to make it right, she said, barely above a whisper. Everything's gone too far. I don't know where to start. Please, Dad, just this once. I'll fix it. The rain hit harder. I closed my eyes, listening to it, each drop like a word I'd been too afraid to say. My voice came out low, rough. Emily, you have to learn how to stand up without dragging others down. If I help you this time, there won't be a last time. For a moment, all I could hear was her crying. I'm sorry, she said between sobs. I didn't mean for it to turn out like this. Jake said the cafe would work, that we'd be fine. I just wanted Mom to be proud of me. The name Mom hit me like a blow. My throat tightened. I could almost see Margaret at her old desk, writing letters with that steady hand that trembled only slightly near the end. I took a breath that hurt and said softly, Love isn't a bottomless well, Emily. When you turn trust into habit, it dies before it's even betrayed. There was nothing for a long time, only the faint whistle of wind through what must have been her open window. Then came her voice, fragile, worn thin. I understand. The line clicked. I lowered the phone onto the table and stared at it until the screen went dark. The house returned to its stillness. The lamplight reflected off Margaret's glass frame, making her face blur and glow like a ghost of gentleness. I picked up the photo, ran my fingers along the edge of the oak, and whispered, I did what you would have done, didn't I? I walked to the window. Outside, the rain was falling harder, silver lines under the streetlight. Somewhere in Denver, my daughter was sitting in a dark room, waiting for a miracle that would never come. Behind her, Jake, the man who had learned to live off the kindness of others, was probably pacing, blaming fate for the collapse he'd built himself. I wondered how long it would take before they understood that money can't rebuild a soul hollowed out by deceit. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the kind Margaret used to save for birthdays and New Year's Eve. The scent of oak and smoke filled the air, heavy and warm. The first sip burned like a confession. I thought about the years I'd worked double shifts to pay Emily's tuition, the nights I'd eaten alone while she studied out of state, the letters she'd sent home. I'll make you proud, Dad. I had believed her, because back then I still believed that love, if you gave enough of it, could fix anything. Now I knew better. Sometimes kindness is just a mirror reflecting only the face of the person who's using it. I set the glass down, switched on the lamp again, and pulled a piece of paper from the drawer. The pen moved slowly across the page. All accounts remain locked. No more transfers. Do not save through anger, but do not save through blindness either. I folded the note, slid it into the drawer beneath Margaret's photo, where her letters still rested, yellowed with time. Outside, the storm hadn't ended. The wind hummed low through the gutters, carrying a sound almost like prayer. I wondered if Emily understood that tonight's call wasn't just a plea for help. It was the last test of the bond between a father and a daughter who had lost her compass. In the dark, the clock kept ticking, slow, relentless, holding the rhythm of my heart together so it wouldn't break. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace, not the kind that comes from forgiveness, the kind that comes from finally knowing where mercy ends. The next afternoon carried a brittle kind of calm, the kind that comes before winter learns your name. Thin streaks of cloud stretched across the Rockies, pale and cold against a bruised sky. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the kettle hiss and the slow, familiar rhythm of Margaret's clock echo from the living room. Then came a knock, soft, hesitant. Another, firmer this time. When I opened the door, Jake was standing on the porch, half shadowed by the overhang. His denim jacket was soaked through, his hair damp, his face the color of sleeplessness. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had been stripped of every story he'd ever told himself. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, his breath fogging in the cold. I'm sorry for coming without calling. I studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. He hesitated like he was asking permission to cross a line that no longer existed, then stepped over the threshold. The smell of wet air and rain came with him. We sat across from each other at the oak kitchen table. I poured a glass of water, placed it on the table, leaving a few inches of distance between us. He didn't touch it. His eyes moved around the room, settling on the small wooden box on the shelf. I remember that box, he said softly. From the hotel. I saw you carrying it through the lobby. I knew it was hers. He drew in a deep breath, voice low. Evelyn called me yesterday, said my name's on some of the account documents. I didn't know. I came to tell you two things. Thank you, and I'm sorry. I folded my hands, said nothing. He started talking, the words rough-edged, unpracticed. The cafe, roast and bloom, Aspen had opened in spring. He'd thought it would be the start of something good. A place where tourists would come when the snow melted, where Emily could finally have something of her own. But the cold lingered into May, and the customers never came. The rent, the staff, the equipment, all of it kept piling up. Linda said we needed to make the place look successful, he said. Said people spend more when they think they're walking into success. So we bought the chandeliers, the walnut tables, the new signage, all of it. I thought it was the wedding fund money from both families. I didn't know it was your retirement account. He looked up at me then, eyes red-rimmed. When Evelyn mentioned the word retirement, I realized I'd already stepped into quicksand. I asked if he'd seen the authorization that opened the sub-account. He shook his head. Emily sent the forms. Your signature was already on it. I thought you'd signed. I should have checked. I didn't. That's my failure. There was no excuse in his voice, no cheap deflection. For the first time, I heard the sound of someone who'd run out of lies to hide behind. He reached into his jacket and placed a small velvet box on the table. Didn't push it forward, just let it sit there between us. You gave these to me, he said quietly. The night we got engaged. I don't deserve to wear them. Inside, silver cufflinks. Polished, untouched. I didn't remember the gift, but I remembered the night, a Mexican restaurant on Nevada Avenue. The hum of conversation. The way I'd tried too hard to sound like a man who still mattered. I nudged the box back toward him. They're just objects, I said. They don't carry the blame. Keep them. Maybe one day, you'll earn the right to wear them. He nodded, eyes glassy, and for a moment the silence between us was almost human again. Then he told me the rest. Linda had turned on Emily, claimed her daughter-in-law spent recklessly, that she'd ruined the Thompson name. When the cafe's numbers fell apart, Linda withdrew every penny of support. Suppliers were demanding payment, the city had fined them for late permits, and the electricity bill was still unpaid. The sign outside Roast and Bloom Cafe was already half torn down. I asked where Emily was in all of this. He hesitated. She's lost, he said. Tired. Angry at you. Angry at me. Mostly angry at herself, I think. She doesn't know who to turn to anymore. He unlocked his phone and slid it across the table. Emails, invoices, purchase orders, the digital breadcrumbs of a slow collapse. These match the withdrawals, he said. I'll print everything. I'll send them to Evelyn. I'll talk to the bank, whatever they need. I just don't want your name dragged through it. I nodded. Do that, I said. Do it today. He promised he would. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since he walked in. Do you love her? His jaw tightened. Yes, he said. But love without responsibility isn't love. It's cowardice, dressed up to look noble. There were nights I thought about leaving to salvage whatever pride I had left, but I stayed. I was afraid she'd fall apart. Sometimes, I said, leaving is the last decent thing you can do. He stared at me, as if hearing something he'd been too afraid to say out loud. Then he rose, exhaled, and said, I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but if Emily ever finds the courage to apologize, I hope you'll listen. I looked at him for a long time. I will, I said, when an apology doesn't come with a request for another wire transfer. That pulled a small, broken smile from him, the kind that hurts to make. Then he turned and walked out into the drizzle. Moments later, my phone buzzed. An email from Jake. Attached were dozens of invoices, scanned receipts, and a photo of the cafe's sign half dismantled. Letters leaning at an angle like a name losing its meaning. At the bottom, a short note. I'll cooperate fully. I'm sorry for everything. I forwarded it to Evelyn with a single line. Please, take it from here. When I hit send, something shifted in my chest. Not relief, not forgiveness, but a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for months. A small, aching quiet, like the sound the world makes right after a storm when it's too tired to keep raining. The first Saturday of October arrived sharp and cold, the kind of morning that carried the scent of iron and wood smoke in the air. Colorado felt older that day, quieter. I took the small wooden box, the one that held Margaret's silver watch, wrapped it in her faded wool scarf, and drove toward the heart of Colorado Springs. The streets were nearly empty. Mist clung to the rows of pines along Nevada Avenue, and the sun, still low, brushed the tops of the old brick buildings like someone too tired to touch the world. Henderson's timepieces still stood at the corner after all these years. The sign, once bright copper, had darkened into a soft, weary bronze, the carved letters worn smooth by wind and time. I pushed the door open. The bell above it gave a small, fragile chime, and the scent of machine oil and pine shavings filled the room. The air felt thick with memory, the kind that presses down on your ribs. Old Henderson looked up from his bench. His white hair gleamed in the lamplight. His glasses magnified a pair of eyes as pale as winter sky. He smiled, slow and gentle, as if greeting someone who'd finally returned. I set the box on his table. "The watch stopped," I said quietly. "It hasn't run since last year." He opened the lid and turned the watch toward the light. The silver face caught the glow, still bright, but the second hand stood frozen between two marks, suspended mid-breath. Henderson wound the crown carefully, brought it to his ear, and listened. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost reverent. "It stopped on June 5th, last year." The words landed like a blow to the chest. June 5th, the day of Emily's wedding. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Henderson said softly, "Some watches don't stop because they're broken. They stop because something or someone needed time to hold still." He wound the crown again, one slow turn, then another. A faint click, a breath. The second hand trembled and began to move. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the small shop, delicate, insistent, like the pulse of a heart waking from sleep. Henderson smiled, closed the case, and pushed the box gently toward me. "Sometimes," he said, "repairing isn't about replacing what's gone. It's about giving time permission to continue." Outside, the morning wind carried the scent of wood smoke and wet leaves. I drove in silence, window cracked just enough to let the air in. I stopped at a cafe on Main Street, ordered an Americano. When the cup touched the table, I pressed my hand to my coat pocket. The watch was there, warm against the fabric, its pulse faint but certain. Margaret's words returned to me then, words from her last letter. "Justice isn't about defeating someone. It's about protecting what's left of your own light." I sat there for a while, letting that truth settle. I didn't need to prove anyone wrong. I only needed to know that I hadn't surrendered who I was. Later that afternoon, I drove to the small church on the edge of town. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, spilling purple and gold across the aisle. Reverend Green was arranging hymnals near the altar. When he saw me, he smiled in that quiet way of his and motioned for me to sit. "The watch is running again," I told him. "It stopped on the day my daughter got married." He folded his hands, studying me for a moment. "Do you think it means something?" "Maybe," I said. "Maybe it's a reminder that pain isn't meant to be permanent." He nodded. "Have you found your answer yet?" "I don't need to win," I said. "I just need to know I wasn't wrong." He smiled faintly, eyes soft. "That's what real justice is, Benjamin. It's not about verdicts. It's about being able to look in the mirror and still see yourself." The church was silent, except for the wind moving through the rafters. For the first time in months, my chest didn't ache when I breathed. Outside, the sky had turned the color of pewter. A fine rain began to fall, cold and even. I walked to my car, the wet pavement shining beneath the streetlights. Inside, I turned on the radio. A slow jazz piece played brass and smoke, a heartbeat in 4/4 time. I rolled the window down an inch, let the scent of rain drift in. At a red light, I looked down at the watch. The second hand kept moving calm, relentless, alive. That night, at home, I set the wooden box on my desk. The lamp's glow fell over it like quiet blessing. I placed Margaret's letter beside the watch. Two small artifacts of a life, one made of time, the other of words. The paper had yellowed, but her handwriting was still steady. "If the day ever comes when our child loses her way, bring her back with truth, not anger." I smiled, a small aching thing. Emily wasn't ready to understand that yet, but one day she would. Time has a way of teaching what parents cannot. I folded the letter carefully, leaned back in the chair, and listened. The clock in the next room ticked in rhythm with the watch on the table, two heartbeats keeping each other alive. And in that sound, I realized something Henderson had never said but must have known. Some things don't need to be fixed. They just need to be forgiven. Outside, the rain eased. The porch light threw long bars of gold across the window pane. I turned off the lamp. The only light left was the reflection of the watch face, pale and unwavering in the dark. And somewhere within that steady ticking, I could almost hear Margaret's breath, a soft, invisible smile moving through the room, reminding me that not all goodbyes stay gone forever. Winter 2024 settled over Colorado Springs like a hush. The city wore its silence in shades of gray and frost. Snow drifted past the window, softening the glow of the Cedar Lane street lamps until everything looked like a photograph left too long in the cold. I met Evelyn in her Denver office, a warm pocket of light amid shelves of papers and the low hum of an electric fireplace. She sat behind her desk, her silver hair catching the lamplight, her eyes steady, kind, and unflinching. "Benjamin," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, "you once told me you wanted to teach, share what you learned from your years as an engineer. What if you turned all this into something good? Use what's left of your funds to start a scholarship. Turn what broke you into something that gives." Her words landed softly, but they stirred something deep, something I thought had long been buried. I sat there, fingers tight around the mug of coffee, and thought of Margaret of the evenings when she and I would sit side by side talking about community projects, about how education could build the kind of bridges concrete never could. That dream of teaching had once burned bright inside me. But then came the years of overtime, mortgage payments, tuition, responsibility, life's quiet machinery grinding down the space where dreams used to live. Now Evelyn's idea felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't realize was still there. A way to transform Emily's betrayal into meaning. A few days later, I called her back. My voice didn't tremble this time. "Do it," I said. "For Margaret." We met at a small cafe near the park in downtown Colorado Springs. The air smelled of burnt wood and fresh waffles, a strange kind of comfort. Evelyn laid out a stack of papers, detailed plans, forms, contacts at Colorado State University. She explained how the fund would work, how it would help students in engineering who'd fallen behind, not for lack of talent, but for lack of means. We decided to call it the Margaret's Hope Scholarship. The name alone made the air feel lighter. It sounded like something that could outlive sorrow. When I signed the papers, my hand shook slightly. Writing Margaret's name on that line felt like touching her again, like she was standing behind me, resting her hand on my shoulder, telling me this was the bridge I was meant to build all along. The process took weeks, calls, documents, virtual meetings, but each step carried a strange peace, like setting new foundations after an earthquake. Evelyn handled the legal work. I coordinated with the university, and by December, the scholarship was officially recognized. The local paper, the Colorado Springs Gazette, reached out. A young reporter named Sarah Coleman wanted to tell the story. I said yes, not for attention, but because I wanted people to know Margaret's name still meant hope. On a cold Sunday morning, the story ran on the front of the community section. The headline read, "Some debts are not paid with money, but with integrity." Sarah wrote with a gentleness I hadn't expected. She didn't mention Emily or the scandal. She only told the story of a father who turned loss into legacy, of a man rebuilding something invisible but enduring. She wrote that the Margaret's Hope Scholarship would give struggling engineering students the chance to keep dreaming, the same way I once built bridges to connect the broken parts of the world. I read the article at my kitchen table, the coffee steaming beside me. For the first time in years, I felt something close to closure. Sarah called me an ordinary father who turned grief into grace. I wondered if Emily would see it, if she'd understand that this was my way of forgiving her, even without saying the words. That afternoon, as the light dimmed, a white envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting stopped me cold jakes. I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple card. "We're expecting a child," it read. "Emily knows about the scholarship," she cried. She didn't say a word. In the bottom corner, drawn in soft violet ink, was a small sprig of lavender, the flower Margaret loved most, the flower of forgiveness, of peace. I sat back in my chair, the card trembling slightly in my hands. A storm of emotions rose: grief, relief, something like quiet joy. I was going to be a grandfather. A new life was coming. But Emily's silence in that message, the way she cried but couldn't speak, told me that shame still stood between us like frost on a window. That night, I placed the card beside Margaret's letter and her watch. The clock's steady ticking filled the room, each beat like a reminder that time was still moving forward, carrying both pain and promise in its current. I knew I needed to see Emily again, to talk about the baby, about what had happened. But I also knew the truth didn't always mend what it revealed. Reverend Green's words came back to me. Justice isn't always punishment, it's peace. The scholarship, the letter, the lavender, they were pieces of that peace. Small, quiet, promises that I could still move forward, even if the road ahead was fogged with things unsaid. And as the wind howled faintly outside and snow began to gather on the porch, I closed my eyes and listened to the ticking watch, steady, faithful, alive. The sound of time forgiving everything I could not. That morning, a thin mist hung low over the backyard, soft as breath. The lavender Margaret planted all those years ago had bloomed again, sturdy, purple, defiant against the cold. The scent drifted through the air, faint but steady, like her voice when she used to call my name from the kitchen window. I held the old shears, their handles rusted smooth by time, and trimmed each stem slowly, careful not to bruise the petals. From inside the house, the clock ticked, steady, patient, unbothered. A year had passed since Emily's wedding, though I no longer measured time in days or months, only in small, quiet mornings like this, where nothing demanded to be fixed, and the world felt almost still. As I bent to gather fallen leaves, the neighbor's dog came barreling through the gate, chasing a squirrel, then stopping beside me, tongue lolling, breath clouding in the cold air. I reached down and stroked its fur. The wind hissed softly through the fence slats. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the Rockies glimmered in pale sunlight. I've lived in Colorado Springs my entire life long enough to know that sometimes peace and loneliness are the same thing, just seen from different angles. By noon, I brewed a pot of black tea and sat on the porch. The silver watch lay on the table beside me, its face tilted toward the light. The second hand moved slow, deliberate, stubborn. The watchmaker had once told me it might stop at any moment, but it hadn't, not once, in a full year. I don't believe in omens, but in that soft ticking, I heard loyalty, the kind that stays long after the world has moved on. Then, the phone buzzed. A message from Jake. "We have a son. His name is Oliver." Attached was a picture Emily's hand, thin and pale, cradling the tiny fingers of a newborn. I zoomed in, tracing the outline of her hand, remembering how that same hand used to clutch mine on the walk to school, small and warm and certain. Beneath the photo, 4 words, no apology, no pretense. Just 4 words, scrawled fast, almost shy. "Thank you, Dad." I sat there for a long time. I didn't know if Emily remembered the day Margaret died, or those evenings in her tiny Boulder apartment when we ate cheap pizza over cardboard boxes because we hadn't bought a table yet. But looking at that photo, I knew something had shifted. Not money, not redemption. Something quieter, more fragile. A broken thread, tied back together not with words, but with silence. That afternoon, I drove to the community library to sign the opening documents for the first semester of the Margaret's Hope Scholarship. Evelyn was waiting by the gate, a small bouquet in her hands. She smiled, her eyes bright despite the gray light. 3 students have been chosen, she said, all children of technical workers. When I read their letters, I thought of you. I nodded. It's Margaret's grace, I said. Evelyn set the flowers on the counter and touched my shoulder lightly before walking away. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway until they disappeared. For a moment, the silence that followed didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. That night, I turned on the lamp in the living room. The clock ticked softly. I sat down and unfolded Margaret's letter again. The ink had faded, but the last line remained as if time had been too gentle to touch it. If our child ever strays too far, let time be the one to bring her home. I folded the letter back into its envelope, stared at the curtain swaying in the night breeze, and thought of her voice calm, firm, full of belief in things that couldn't be seen but could be felt. I remembered our last conversation in the hospital. Margaret had asked if I was afraid of being alone. I told her no, because when a man chooses to do what's right, loneliness becomes a companion, not a punishment. She smiled faintly, her fingers trembling in mine. Then, let everything find its own way, she said. Tonight, as the light struck the watch face, I understood what she meant. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to keep time for us until we're ready to listen again. Near midnight, I heard a car pull up outside. Headlights swept across the window, then vanished. When I opened the door, no one was there. Only a white envelope on the porch, its corners damp from the cold. Inside was a photograph. Emily holding her baby, standing in front of Roast and Bloom. The cafe was closed, its windows dark. A for sale sign hung crooked on the door. Beneath it, in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. I hope you'll stop by just for coffee. Nothing else. I held the photo for a long time. The paper bent slightly in my hand. I could almost hear her voice, the tone she used when she was a child, testing the boundary between apology and hope. I placed the photo beside the clock. I didn't know if I would go. But even thinking about it eased something inside me that had been clenched for too long. I turned off the light and walked slowly down the hallway toward my room. The wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the faint scent of lavender. The next morning, The world was washed clean. Sunlight spilled across the yard, bright but soft. The clock kept its rhythm, each tick steady as breath. I sat on the wooden chair by the garden, brushed my hand over a new bloom, and let the silence hold me. No anger, no resentment, just the kind of quiet that feels like forgiveness. That's when I understood. Justice doesn't mean winning. It means waiting, trusting that time will do what we can't. Time, in its strange, patient way, is the fairest judge we have. I whispered then, not sure if it was to Margaret, to Emily, or to myself, maybe all three. Inside that small house in Colorado Springs, the clock went on, ticking slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of life itself. Out the window, a sparrow perched on a lavender stem, then took off, its wings scattering light into the air. And I smiled. At last, everything was at peace. If this story stayed with you, don't let it fade when the credits roll. Share it with someone who's still carrying the weight of silence. Remind them, forgiveness isn't surrender. It's courage, the kind that keeps a heart alive when the world has gone quiet. Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so stories like this about family, time, and the small, relentless ways love survives can keep finding the ones who still believe in second chances.